In this video, we're going to be talking about group therapies, behavioral therapies, and then evaluating therapy as a whole. In the previous video, we talked about psychoanalysis, humanistic therapies, and cognitive therapies. So if you have any questions about those, go back, rewatch that one as we get into our video today. So let's start with group therapies, picking up from where we were leaving off. Group therapies are a good way for a therapist to see clients interact with others. So this is really good for people who are dealing with the same types of things. This is like a low-level type of therapy, if you will. This is great for like support systems and creating groups around it. It's one of the reasons why there are groups that are like Alcoholics Anonymous or other self-help groups, right? Where you have people with same experiences, sharing those experiences, and then learning and growing from them as well. We see this with some evidence that clients are more likely to try new things when they see other people in the room, right? Hearing that it worked, something worked for someone else is a much better testimonial than hearing that from a therapist or whatever, right? A personalized story about how they used this therapeutic technique to overcome their anxiety or addiction or whatever sometimes leads people to try things that could be beneficial to them, right? The downside here is that we don't really have a lot of reliable data. A lot of these self-help groups are anonymous, right? That's part of the gig, is that nobody really knows who you are, and therefore we don't really have a lot of data tracking this group therapy. So that's not a knock, right? Again, any type of therapy is going to be beneficial. It just might not be the right fit necessarily for everybody. And if we're looking to evaluate therapies as a whole, having data is one of those things that's really going to be beneficial to our process of understanding, which type of therapy should we recommend in different situations. There's also another type of group therapy that's family therapy that basically looks at the family as a whole. So this can be both, like marriage counseling, but also like raising kids, where the family goes into therapy together and then gets treated together as a system, as opposed to individual people, right? So they can rely on the relationships that are there. They can rely on the family ties, the different roles that everyone has within the family to kind of change things up and open up avenues of communication. Because most of the times when families are struggling, it's a lack of communication, whether things aren't being heard, things aren't being said, whatever. So family therapy tends to open up these lanes of communication within a family. Let's move to behavioral therapies now. So behavioral therapies, again, putting your AP Psych review hat on, right? Behavior therapies are probably going to deal with how we respond to certain things, right? It's addressing things through operant conditioning, classical conditioning, and observational learning. So when we talk about behavioral therapies, we have to understand that psychologists who specialize in behavioral therapies assume that the problem behaviors are a result of learning, right? That these are things that have been learned over time and therefore have to be unlearned, right? Through other conditioning techniques. One such example in behavioral therapy is a bedwetting alarm. If you don't know what this is basically it's a fabric that you put underneath the sheets of the bed, and when it senses liquid, it sets off an alarm, which then wakes the person up. This then conditions the body to wake up before it goes to the bathroom. Therefore, the child or adult who has to relearn these things is no longer wetting the bed. So classical conditioning absolutely works. We also saw in the video with the phobias that exposure therapy works as well. Peter's rabbit is a famous example of a kid who was afraid of rabbits, who eventually, by the end of an exposure therapy session, over the course of a few weeks, because that's usually how it's done, because it must be done slowly, that then, Peter is basically petting the rabbit at the end, and it becomes a friend of his and whatever. But this is an exposure therapy. So you're exposing someone to the thing that they're afraid of, which then they will reframe their anxiety. They'll learn to not be anxious around it, right? You replace the negative response with a positive one. You could do deep breathing techniques. You can do meditation. You can do any other type of ways to kind of change the way that the body responds to a positive one, right? And again, this is done through systematic desensitization, through a hierarchy that is usually created with the patient, to come up with, what's the most anxiety producing aspect of your phobia, and then work your way through how that all works. This can also be done through virtual reality, which is a cool new uh, use of that technology, is using virtual therapy to conquer some of these fears that might be otherwise hard or expensive. You can imagine if you're afraid of flying, and you come up with a desensitization hierarchy that includes like going to the airport multiple times or going through airport security multiple times, right? You can only do that if you have a ticket. So are you buying plane tickets over and over and over again? That can become and then not getting on the plane, that can become very expensive. So virtual reality therapy is a good substitute. And then over the years, it's just been getting better and better and better. We also know about aversive conditioning. So this is the opposite of exposure therapy, where you replace a positive response with a negative one. This can be there's drugs that you can put in someone who's alcoholic beverages for someone who's an alcoholic that makes them violently ill. So they have one sip of their preferred spirit of choice, and then they become violently ill as a result. They eventually will associate the negative response with the drinking and then potentially stop drinking. This works really well in the short term, right? You can imagine that this works well. Every time you take a drink of beer or whiskey or something, you just get violently, violently ill. But in the long term, it's not as successful, right? People are smart. So one of the things that behavioral therapists have to deal with all the time is overcoming our cognition, right? If I'm an alcoholic and I have all these drops and all of the booze I have in my house, but I drive past a bar on my way home, I know that the stuff in that bar doesn't have that. So I can just, short circuit around it, and then therefore the conditioning is just completely useless, right? It's not serving a purpose anymore. So oftentimes, as we'll see, and your book makes a big point about this, so make sure you read that section a few times. Behavior therapy is tied to cognitive therapy and creating what's called cognitive behavior therapy. It's basically like the all-star team of therapies. It is one of the most widely used types of therapy that we can then change. Again, if we can change our thinking and our behaviors, we can kind of attack these things at the same time. Thinking about like obsessive compulsive disorder, right? So you have the obsessions, which are the thoughts, and then you have the compulsions, which are the actions. You can use behavioral therapy to change the compulsions. You can use cognitive therapies to change the obsessions, and then you've just really effectively treated obsessive compulsive disorder from both aspects, not one or the other. And we also know behavior modification, right? Things like a token economy, giving out, you get five stars every time you do something right, and over time, right, or a star every time you do something right, you can cash them in. 10 stars gets you this privilege or whatever. It's creating, a different incentive structure that then can be used to reinforce positive behavior. There's some ethical questions here, though, too. Like, who determines what is good behavior or bad behavior? Think back to the video we watched from The Big Bang Theory, where Sheldon is, giving chocolates just every time the behavior is done well, right? Just offers chocolate. Like, well, who determines what is good behavior or bad behavior, right? That there's an ethical question there. Also, like, how do you deal with like these larger questions about what happens when the reinforcement stops? Does it just go back? Is behavior modification really just something that we should be doing, right? Just tweaking personalities here or there. That it depends, right? I think if it's a severe disorder, then it's a different question than if it's just like, oh, I don't really like this about you, so let's change, how we treat you and how we offer reinforcement or punishments for that matter. So let's talk about how should we evaluate this, right? So we've talked about a number of different therapies, right? That's actually Freud as a young man on the left, and then you should recognize Carl Rogers, and that's B.F. Skinner on the right. So how do we evaluate this? Are some therapies better than others? So Most therapy is done by clinical or counseling psychologists. You have psychiatrists. You also have social workers, licensed therapists, and community health programs. You know that's kind of who does therapy. Um, but by far, the most people that do it are these clinical or counseling psychologists, depending on their background. And we also have to understand that most people enter therapy because they're not feeling well, and most people leave because they feel better, right? So we know that just talking about your problems, as broad as that is, makes people feel better. So in some instances, therapy as a whole is good, right? It makes people feel better. But the question that we should be asking is, what is the most effective types of therapy, right? If we're not looking to spend years of our lives and thousands of dollars, then we want to know, what is the best, right? Just like how you want to take the best type of medication for the thing for the illness that you have, you want to be getting the best type of therapy for your specific situation. Uh, and so we got to talk about a number of different things, right? So scared straight phenomenon. Oftentimes in therapeutic sessions, you know, people will see, even just waiting in the waiting room, like, oh man, I'm not as bad as that person, or that person has a lot going on, and that can kind of kick yourself into gear a little bit to get back on, to overcome anxiety or depression or whatever. We also know there's placebo effect. When people think that they're getting treated for something, their body responds in the way that as if they actually had, even if there was no actual drug being present. Well, placebo effect can happen in therapy as well, right? You have uh, the belief that you're going to get better, coupled with a authority figure, right, a psychologist who is practiced in and has devoted their lives to helping people get better. Sometimes just that fact alone cures people. We also know about regression towards the mean, right? You can't be that depressed for that long. Eventually, you'll start to come back, or you can't have anxiety reactions at a 10 for long enough. You'll eventually come back down. So we know that our lives are filled with ups and downs, but for the most part, we kind of revert back to our baseline personality, right? So we know that exists as well. We also need to be aware of the clinician's perspective, right? If you're if you don't believe in psychoanalysis, then you shouldn't go to a therapist who specializes in that. If you think that humanistic psychology is just a bunch of nonsense, that you need some behavioral therapy, then you need to know what your clinician's perspective is, right? What are they bringing to the table? We have a little bit of a criticism here from Eisnick. We know, or his research has shown, and remember he did some research with personality, that a lot of the same number of people got better without therapy than with therapy. He did a randomized control study where he randomly assigned people to a therapy condition or a non-therapy condition, and at the end of the day, the same number of people got better from, I think it was anxiety issues than otherwise, right? So he basically points out that therapy is not worth it. On the other hand, when we take a meta analysis of therapy in general as a whole, we know that it does a number of things. Therapy shortens the duration of mental disorders, it lessens the impact, right? So they're not as severe. And it gets people back on their feet in a more healthy, positive way. So we know that therapy is good. We know that therapy helps people. We know that it shortens timelines of the duration of illnesses, and it helps people get back on their feet and recover in a way so that they don't necessarily have the same setbacks in the future. At the end of the day, what we really want is to focus on evidence-based practices, right? This is a therapeutic technique that combines really the individual therapist's expertise, the most recent scientific literature, and the best literature in that field, and also the patient's values and expectations. Because we have to remember that even the people seeking therapy have a certain belief as to what's going to happen or what their expectations are. So if the therapist says, my expectation is to cure you of all your issues, and you're just like, I just don't want to be depressed anymore, right? You're going to have a mismatch. So having all three of these things accounted for creates what we would call evidence-based therapy. So we know that the cost of disorders is high. Good therapy is really important. what are some of the therapies that we know that works? Well, a lot of the behavioral therapies work for sure. We know the bedwetting alarm works. We know token economies work. We know exposure therapy works. And most of that is because when the problem is clear cut, there are very specific targeted therapies that can address them. If you're afraid of snakes, being exposed to snakes over time in a therapeutic session will calm down that anxiety, right? It is a very clear cut issue that is a very clear cut solution. The issue is when we have some of these more generalized anxiety, major depressive disorder, right? These kinds of things that are kind of don't have a specific pinpoint, those can be a lot harder to treat. And that makes a lot of sense, right? There's not necessarily the one thing that's causing it. So at the end of the day, every case is different. The therapist needs to approach each client with a new sense of what's possible. The relationship with the client is really important. Some people go to a number of different therapists before they find the right fit, right? Finding that right fit is important. It's if you don't like your therapist, you're not going to talk to them about things. You're not going to buy into what they're asking you to do. You're not going to do the homework. You're not going to do, the therapy that they're telling you to do because you don't have a good relationship with them. So while the clinician's expertise is important, the clinician's relationship with the client is really important too. That helps create new ideas. That helps new hypotheses get tested, and ultimately better therapy is done when they have the client's perspective in mind, the scientific literature, and their own experience, in their back pockets. Let's talk about some of the more, I guess you could say, out there types of therapies. So there's a number of interesting things related to eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or EMDR. EMDR is used to treat post-traumatic stress disorder, of all things. The thought process is that when someone is reliving a hurtful memory, literally ask them to move their eyes back and forth behind their eyelids, jotting around. And it works. 84% of the time, EMDR helps with post-traumatic stress symptoms. The thought process is that it is both a little bit of exposure therapy, a little bit of placebo effect, and that the eye movements can trick the brain into thinking that you're dreaming, which then relieves a lot of that anxiety from the memories themselves, right? It's this weird thing, and it works. We don't really know why, but we have some theories or I guess I should say hypotheses as to how it works. We also know about light exposure for seasonal affective disorder, right? The wintertime blues, people who have that can actually get blue light machines that shine blue light in their faces, and that helps jumpstart seasonal affective disorder. Now, we spend a lot of time in these videos, although these are short videos and I'm moving pretty quickly, looking at the differences between the types of therapies. Let's take a little bit and talk about what they have in common. All therapies offer hope, new perspectives, and a really empathic relationship, right? People go into therapy, psychologists become therapists because they're interested in helping others. That empathetic relationship can sometimes be the only empathetic relationship they have with anyone else, right? The client now I'm speaking about. So all therapies offer a new way of looking at things. They also know that things can and will get better. Is this placebo effect? Maybe. But at the end of the day, the therapist is mostly concerned with making that person better. So if it's a placebo that does it, fine. If that's what gets the person not depressed or no longer anxious or no longer obsessive compulsive, then that's a really good thing. Now, we don't want to be prescribing placebos, right? Because there's no real medicine in them. But we also can harness that ability of the placebo effect to help people in therapy. We also know that therapists form emotional bonds with their clients and that their personal beliefs influence their practice. So it's important that therapists then disclose those personal beliefs, right? They explain what they are. If you're going to a therapist who is deeply religious and you're not, that's going to influence your relationship with them. That's going to influence the type of therapy that you receive from them. So understanding what those what the therapists bring to the table, understanding what you bring to the table is all a really important recipe for success when we talk about therapies. So that's a lot. So to recap some of the big points here, we know that behavioral therapies work really well for specific types of issues, right? Things that have specific causes. We know that group therapies work really well to get people to try new things that they might not otherwise. They have testimonials from their peers. And we took a look at therapies as a whole, that all therapies, kind of offer this new way of looking at things, which is always a good thing, especially if you're stuck in a rut or you have, anxiety or depression or something. So there's a lot here. Please make sure you're reading the text and following along. And in the next video, we're going to talk about biomedical therapies, right? These are psychopharmaceuticals, these are surgeries, and even electroconvulsive therapy, which is something that we'll spend some time talking about and how that works. So that's it for this video. I will see you guys next time.